You know very well the European Union faces a severe housing crisis which affects persons of all ages and different families. The housing prices have grown with around 48%, an evolution determined by several factors, including high costs for construction materials, higher rates, and less new constructions, which has reduced the offer and more acquisitions. The approach of this crisis is crucial for economic and social cohesion, and in order to reduce differences in the European Union, which are fundamental objectives of the cohesion policy. Every year, billions of euros from the Fund for the Regional Development are invested in social housing and in energy efficiency. It is essential for the European Union to make more accessible housing available for population categories with low and medium incomes all over the European Union. The structures of today's hearing will be the following. The debate will take place in two sessions. The first part will be moderated by me, and we will discuss about the way we can stimulate the offer of available and affordable housing. The second part of the hearing will be moderated by Mrs. Langen-Zippen, Vice President of the Ample Committee, and we will discuss better access for everyone to decent housing and affordable housing. Now I will pass the floor to Mrs. Langen-Zippen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Benet, for giving me the floor. I'm replacing Ample Chair Lee Anderson, who unfortunately could not be with us, and it's my pleasure to co-chair this joint public hearing with you. Let me also start by warmly welcoming our experts, invited speakers, members of the Regi, Empl and Housing Committees, and all other audience. With this public hearing, we are launching an extremely important discussion, which is, as you said, Mr. Benet, very timely. To set the scene for discussion from the Empl perspective, I would that already before the pandemic, it had become clear that there is a clear lack of adequate, decent and affordable housing in Europe. Many Europeans are living in unhealthy, low quality, energy poor or overcrowded spaces, or worse, facing eviction or homelessness. Research carried out by our agency demonstrates that there are 80 million people in the EU overburdened by housing costs, and some 10% of the EU population spend 40% or more in their income on housing. The housing cost overburden is significantly higher among the EU population at risk of poverty and low-income households. Eurostat shows that 4% of the EU population experience severe housing deprivation, and housing deprivation is at the heart of poverty and social exclusion and closely linked with unemployment. The affordability crisis is foremost an urban phenomenon, while rural areas face their own problems regarding housing, such as depopulation. The situation differs greatly between different regions in Europe, and a great variety of local, regional and national housing solutions exists. Approaches such as housing first have been proven by efficient in providing long-term solutions to those in need. The European Pillar of Social Rights recognises the right to social housing and housing assistance for those in need, the right to adequate shelter and services to the homeless, and recognise the need of protection against eviction of vulnerable people. The rights enshrined in the pillar now need to be turned into reality. The public hearing provides an opportunity to put forward proposals for this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Vice President Langen-Zippen. Now I want to give the floor to Mrs. Irene Tinali, Chair of the Special Committee of Housing.
Thank you very much, President. So good morning, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking the Ample and Regi chairs for inviting me to address you today. The housing crisis facing Europe is really something that encompasses different sectors and different issues, because it stands at the intersection of our economic, social and environmental policies. It affects the daily lives of millions of Europeans, challenges our cohesion objectives, and demands an integrated approach that recognizes the different realities across urban and rural landscapes. So the Housing Special Committee was established in recognition that housing requires dedicated attention at the European level. While, of course, respecting the principle of subsidiarity, we acknowledge that the European coordination can provide significant value added in addressing these challenges. So today we confront a very dramatic situation. Housing costs consume over 40% of disposable income for nearly a quarter of low-income households across the European Union. Young people are delaying family formation due to housing insecurity. Energy poverty, as was also mentioned earlier, affects many people, approximately 50 million Europeans, many living in poorly insulated homes. And meanwhile, homeless populations are growing in nearly all member states. So these challenges have been exacerbated by several factors, where the housing market has become increasingly shaped by external market forces that do not always necessarily align with the evolving demands of household and society. Over time, there is basically the impact of different markets, however, always centered on the same stock of houses, have overlapped, causing new market dynamics that we have not experienced before. So it is in this context that the committee will work and pursue the priorities of its political mandate. So first, the European Union's cohesion policy instruments must continue to offer critical leverage for boosting the supply of affordable housing. This directly addresses the first theme of today's hearing. Cohesion funding has proven essential for balanced territorial development, enabling both urban regeneration projects in cities and community infrastructure in rural settlements. The European Regional Development Fund has already demonstrated its potential, but we need more targeted approaches that recognize the distinct housing markets in metropolitan areas versus small towns and villages. Second, we must improve housing quality and sustainability across all territories. As our speakers today will discuss, housing adequacy varies dramatically between urban centers and rural communities. Urban dwellers often face overcrowding but benefit from energy-efficient buildings, while rural residents may have more space but struggle with poorer building standards and higher energy costs. Third, we must address the unique systemic barriers to housing access in different geographical contexts. In cities, this involves controlling speculation and ensuring land is available for social housing. In rural areas, it means maintaining services that make housing viable and attractive. Throughout all territories, it requires developing appropriate regulatory frameworks that protect vulnerable groups. Beyond addressing current issues, we are looking at different housing models which can offer best practices, potential solutions such as innovative, cooperative and social housing, repurposing unused buildings, leveraging on the best technological innovation in the construction sector. So I really looking forward to the insights from today's distinguished speakers and the ensuing discussion, because we are now in the phase of gathering all possible ideas and solutions for the European citizens. So the expertise assembled here today will undoubtedly strengthen our approach as the House Special Committee is working toward a comprehensive housing strategy that truly leaves no one behind. Thank you.
Mulțumesc, doamnei președinte.
Thank you, Chair. Now we have the section dedicated to our two experts, Mrs. Eva Novak, Head of the Direction for Strategic Planning and Coordination of EU Funds in the Ministry of Regional Development in Croatia, and Mr. Denis Iceasu, Regional Minister for Housing and Urban Agenda of the Basque Country government in Spain. 10 minutes each in order to hear about best practices in the two regions. We'll start with Mrs. Eva Novak.
Good day. Hello. Mr. Benea, Chair of Regi Committee, Ms. Langenzipen, Vice Chair of the Ample Committee, Ms. Tinali, Chair of Special House Committee, dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to be here and present Croatian experience in relation to the housing crisis that is actually now more than ever seen as one of the priority to be resolved on the level of the European Union, but together with member states. Please, next slide. Before I start to go with our experience on the cohesion policy funds on the housing solutions, I would like to present that Croatia has prepared its first national housing plan as a midterm document, which actually sets up the measures and priorities to be resolved. But before I move to this part, I would like to express that actually we have done thorough mapping with the view to ensure the best measures to be implemented in the period until 2030. It is very important to mention that Croatia faces the similar challenges as maybe other member states, in which demand surpasses the supply. And due to these causes, prices are going up significantly. This is, of course, not something that happened recently. This is the structural problem of our overall construction sector that actually has not been recovering since 2008. Just for your information, in Croatia, currently, we can build up housing plans 30% less than we could before the major crisis in 2008. Of course, there is significant increase in the prices of the housing and construction elements, which also support increase of the prices of the new housing buildings. Also, we are having some special conditions in Croatia, and this is considering that actually every third household is overcrowded. But also, we are facing a serious crisis in relation to our young people and our young families. And this is that our young people stays at home with their parents for 6 years longer than this is in the average of the European Union. Affordable housing is something that is very important, and Croatia is having 2.4 billion housing units. However, all housing units are not used for housing and for living. 40% of those housing units are not used for living, and out of them, 600,000 actually are unoccupied. Of course, I will turn to other part that is around 400,000 housing units which are used for tourist or other economic sectors. Also, we have made the analysis which actually states that in Croatia there is a gap on the housing units that accounts to 240,000, which means that actually if we put aside that there is a 600,000 housing units that are unoccupied, and yet that there is a housing gap to 240,000 housing units, that would mean that Croatia is actually not having the problem of the lack of the housing units, but it is the problem how these housing units are actually used. Our housing midterm document, housing policy plan that is prepared to last until 2030, actually is comprised from the several elements. And this is related to the affordability of housing in relation to the purchase or to the lease or rent, then sustainability issues, and after all, advanced spatial planning models. As I said, this affordability part is important since we know that our young people, young families are not in position to ensure themselves with the first housing property, and to this we will make several measures to be encountered. Then sustainability is in relation to the energy efficiency measures, security of space, better housing living condition, etc. And the last special planning model is that actually whatever we are planning in future should be in line with all the environmental impact assessments. When we are talking about housing policy tools, we will make this through the three major activities. This is the governmental framework which will be amended, local initiatives that will be supported, and of course finance and investments. Amount of the overall housing policy measure accounts to the almost 2 billion euros. And this will be, and this is not the exhausted list of the measures that will be implemented, are support for building or buying first housing units for the people that are under 45, for real estate tax refund or refund of 50% of the paid VAT. Also, as I mentioned, there is a huge number of empty properties which will be activated through the measures that will be implemented. Then Croatia will focus on the development of non-profit housing associations and, of course, incentives for private investments. And now, just to move to the most important part of this presentation, this is how the cohesion policy funds can actually provide support for the social housing. I think that in the regulatory framework, actually, we are having set up quite well level of activities that can support resolving the housing crisis in the European Union, and Croatia has already, in relation to our programming process 21-27, developed the measures for the social housing on the rural areas that are part of the program Competitiveness and Cohesion. And through these grants, we will use to build new housing units on the rural territories in Croatia. A part of this, we also, through the midterm review exercise, actually ensured additional funding for those areas, and we are hoping that maybe in future, when some amendments will be done on the regulatory framework, we will ensure even more funding for those areas. Apart from this, through the financial instrument, Croatia is actually implementing financial incentives for the urban territories in which the financial viable projects can be financed through the Urban Development Fund within the integrated territorial investments. This is also something that will be ensured through the level of the measures under the midterm review. And the third cornerstone is EIB technical support. Technical support is granted to 5 Croatian cities from the side of the EIB, and we are hoping that even more activities in relation to the social housing will be done through the EIB grants in the next period. Also, I would like to share with you additional information, that is that Croatia is not only implementing these activities in relation to the housing, we are also, through the deinstitutionalization process, supporting activities of housing solutions in the long-term care. Of course, in respect to sustainability, we are having the multiple measures in relation to the increase of energy efficiency in the multi-apartment housing from the EU funds, but as well as from the national funds. And this is something that needs to be actually emphasized, that if we are using only EU funds, this is not sufficient. We need to actually cooperate and to include national funding to be in a synergy with what we are doing on the level of the Cohesion Policy Fund to ensure as much as possible best solution for our citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Novak. Now I give the floor to Mr. Denis Hiceaso for 10 minutes also.
Buenos días, señor.
Good morning. Dear colleagues, I would like to start by thanking this joint committee, this opportunity we've been given to see the position of the Basque country in a period on housing, in a period when there's a crisis in Europe which is attacking competitiveness and the balance in the EU. Now, all these are objectives which have to do with the nature of the project. I won't spend too much time on describing this phenomenon. It's already been diagnosed, but the number of households are growing a lot more than in other areas. The building of housing, the empty housing, the large surfaces, conversion of commercial buildings into housing is not sufficient where there is an increase of demands for all type of our lifestyle. This has given rise to an increase in prices for the middle class in Europe and in the Basque country. With our countries has done a lot of good within the last decade as for housing, and in Spain we're very strong in rental property and protection, and also various initiatives behind. But these we still have not been able to fulfill the demand, and we still require public policies. This 2025, there was a declaration of the markets in the various Basque cities, a common policy within many member states, where the virtue is that of considering housing a right and a main right to maintain the rents. We're looking at the law, which was approved by the Spanish government in 2023 on the right to housing, and we're looking at a fiscal review which will help the renters with a lower income, and we want to ensure that the rental market has more and more housings available. What we're trying to do in the next few months is this future law in urgent regulations for housing, and that Parliament will approve this year. We are willing to fulfill many of these rules which are considered critical for the more vulnerable areas where we look at this lack of housing available. There are many reasons here. The Basque region has the possibility of having more than 75,000 protective rents, but these are blocked because of bureaucratic problems. And we've seen that the urban requirements are necessary for the development in our country, and we need to structure better the buildable areas and maintain this program of housing. When we look at the costs for urbanization which they have to deal with, there is necessary to have certain action to change this trend.
A la contratación.
When we have to deal with the contracts and needs for building. Another important chapter in the construction of protective housing has to do with financing. We have to have a special ecosystem in the social aspect of housing. Public powers alone are not sufficient to deal with this colossal investment challenge which we have to deal with. We need to have private resources in order to increase sufficiently protected housing. The private sector, natural fact, builds 50% of protected housing because we have this lengthy tradition in this sector. Many cases have been allowing land to be sold to private promoters, and also this program for rentals which helps owners who let their properties at a protective rate. And when we're also looking at the autonomous regions in Spain, we are getting property from private owners and putting it in the protected sector. And we're also having further steps for cooperation with public-private nature in order to have capitals which will produce a lower value, but will be for longer periods. Now, the government is already working with the European Investment Bank, and we're wanting to incorporate within this initiative as a financial partner so that we can develop through public-private investment 10,000 homes. But this allows us to set aside the Basque question. We want to take this opportunity that you've given us to say something in favor of this model of protective housing and European collective housing. These are formulas that have allowed for greater social cohesion than in other areas. A collective housing sees a European element and has to be one of the main pillars of the social dimension in Europe. For the first time in its history, Europe has to develop investment policies on a large scale in a sustainable way over time. We're not talking about a Marshall Plan, which was just temporary. We're talking about a constant structural strategy which will allow cities and metropolitan areas to develop plans for increasing the new homes. The Next Generation Fund has really supported the housing market and our housing policy in our country. So we've been able to build more than 1,500 homes given the help of the Recovery and Resilience Fund. But now we need to reduce differences between the countries with investments in public housing. We believe that Europe must have some clear targets to harmonize this, using European funds to contribute to reach this convergence. This implies the needs to give a priority to investments in areas where there are fewer social housing and giving it as a more reasonable and equitable housing. When we adding to this, we have to be careful to the improvement of residential housing. Here we've gone beyond 20,000 approved households. We had 184 million from the mechanism of resilience and recovery, whilst the Basque country has added from its own fund, given to the many neighbouring communities who've set up this whole system for the energy reconversion. The Basque area, which has the most oldest household units of Europe and is doing this recovery, it is necessary to bear in mind not only the energy question, but also that it has to be accessible. At the moment, improvement is based exclusively, or recovery is based exclusively, on the energy strategy, which has pushed technology for ventilation, for the improvement of the thermal elements, which have led to a more sustainable and resilient group of housing for decarbonisation. So this should be balanced with more ambitious project for accessibility in order to contribute to greater inclusion and have a greater amount of housing. This offers a great an improved development of a vertical transport system, and this has led to technological development where we find a difference in many international markets. This accessibility put into the areas built in the 20th century improve the social measures too. Now, today we want to ensure that Europe does not forget the household cause. The political threats and the need for rearming cannot be critical for the housing system. It would be a big mistake because it would end up damaging our own children. supporting collective and accessible housing is part of our social model in the post-war era, and it must give rise to equal opportunities. This is part of our moral obligation to give hope to the European middle classes. We're aware of the geopolitical difficulties at this moment in history, and we are aware that what is urgent has changed very much over the last few weeks. External threats, though, must not make us forget of our social challenges, and housing is one of the main pillars which must be protected. Apart from security and defense, Europe will resist better with a structural program for building accessible housing, which offers hope to the middle classes and reduces the danger of social injustice, which generates so much disaffection in our political system. And European democracy is based on this. Thank you.
It's the time for our rapporteurs. And we start with Mr. Marcos Rossempere, rapporteur of an INIE report on the role of cohesion policy investments in resolving the housing crisis for the Regi Committee.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chairman and chairs of the two committees that are part of this joint point on the housing problem. First of all, I'd like to thank both of the experts who took the floor for the vision they have given us on the management of the of the regional level of an autonomous community. It's this point for our housing policy and ensuring that it becomes a priority of the EU, we have to consider all the levels of administration. This is a multi-factor problem. It's not a question of regional, local authorities or national authorities or the EU itself. We are convinced that there has to be inter-administrative coordination in order to deal with an extremely difficult problem. Now, I'm going to look at some of the policies which were detailed from the Basque region, because we appear to be innovative and policies which are sustained over time. They've given results, and they are the result of an agreement between different political parties who have been present in the various Basque governments, and over the years have shown that they are successful, and they've shown that the policy cannot be something that just says, right, we're giving everything now because we're convinced about this and 4 or 5 years later it's finished. No, we're looking at public promotion, at rentals, at taxes, management, innovation for protected housing. But what is necessary is to have a public aspect. Now, I represent the Committee for Regional Development. I'm looking at the public side. Now, you mentioned the funds for next generation, but those will only be temporary over time. And when they are finished, we will have to keep on funding with European funds as well, public housing policies. And so we have to have access to the large policies, regional funds, cohesion fund, and the European Social Fund and the FEDES Fund. Now, at the moment, these funds only allow 2 objectives, energy recovery and social housing. Now, in this committee, we're going to submit a report, and what we are asking is, on the one hand, to take advantage of the midterm review to look at the funds that are being invested, and on the other, a small legislative reform so that we can have these objectives within public policies and include different criteria for vulnerable groups, financial instruments with public funding tied to the public use of the land and of the households. I would conclude by stating in our communities and other European regions, we've seen how household construction, which which were funded publicly ended up being sold to big conglomerates, which ended up eliminating the householders. Now, we want to ensure that there has to be a certain conditionality so that we don't lose the priority use, the public priority use. Thank you.
Mrs. Estrella Galan, Rapporteur for the opinion in Ample Committee.
Muchas gracias, presidente.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the rapporteurs and all the people who have submitted this report, because at this moment in time, European citizens are hoping that this discussion takes place because it's a real need and it's our responsibility to deal with this. As you know, within the EU, 31% of renters spend more than 40% of their monthly income for their household. Young people between 18 and 24 live with their parents because they have no possibility of becoming emancipated. Now, this is just an example of the crisis, a household crisis, which is hitting millions of people in a vulnerable situation, especially in cases of poverty and exclusion, which is impacting the whole EU. This report, as I said at the beginning, is more important than ever, and I would like to claim two key points from the social perspective, bearing in mind the committee where I'm preparing this document. First of all, it is essential recognizing that access to a household has to be a fundamental right at the same level as other rights, such as the right to schooling or right to health. At the moment, this right is recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the European Pillar for Social Rights. However, it is not included in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU. Now, this has to change. The right to a household has to be included in the Charter, must have a solid legal framework which obliges the member states to consider this right in the policies of each country. It is also essential to strengthen possibilities for social and public housing, because the existing crisis shows that the market alone cannot guarantee access to an accessible housing for the whole population. So it is necessary to have a social focus which leads us to construct and have a pack of public housing for vulnerable people, young people, vulnerable people, migrants, poor, lower income people, disabled. Anyone who has to look at a further barrier before having access to housing. For this reason, we have to put limits to investment funds. They are buying up our cities and are changing our houses into speculative properties. These are factors who give a priority to money over the right to housing, have contributed significantly to the existing crisis, inflating prices and excluding thousands of people to access to a home. So it is essential that housing financed with public funds has to be blocked and must remain in public hands. In the Union, you have 1,200,000 people without this, and yet there's 11 million empty houses. It is scandalous, and it is not acceptable, and it cannot be accepted within the middle of a housing crisis. So we need solutions, and we need to encourage have to be used to feed the stock. Yeah, I have to cut. Am I being told that I have to stop? Yes? Or can I carry on?
Thank you.
Bueno, en definitiva.
So, in conclusion, We must not forget that the housing crisis is a question of human rights, human dignity and social justice. And to resolve it, we must guarantee that the right to housing has to be recognized as a fundamental right, and the public and social housing policy have to be a priority in the Europe agenda. Only in that case can we have an inclusive and just Europe.
The floor to Rapporteur for the Special Committee on Housing, Mr. Borja Jiménez Laranz.
Gracias,
Thank you. Now, to deal with the problem, it is essential, first of all, identifying its causes. Housing demand is very high, but the offer is slowed down by the cost of production and also structural problems in the sector. There's not sufficient offer. An increase in housing will just increase the prices, and we'll find ourselves in a worse situation. Cohesion funds can have an essential role for the offer, which is something we need to do if we want to comment on accessible housing, including using cohesion funds is a good solution. I think the European Commission is working on this, and I consider this as good news. Now, you have to encourage a strategy of investments in the housing sector through existing European funds, such as cohesion, next generation, and the role of the European Investment Bank, if it is possible, and within intervening in the policy of the member states. This formula, furthermore, is being combated that we've seen in the Regional Development Committee, which where we have an example in my region, Aragon, where we have set up a plan for more housing, and we've reached now 350 million euros, of which 103 million euros come from European funds. And the plan is that of helping young people, people who have problems to find housing, can do it. Now, the cohesion funds for the urban development are essential. This is a key for the future of cohesion policy and increase social housing for energy efficiency as well. So the role of the regional and local bodies is key. They're the ones who know the area, know their population, and they're the ones who have to approve the urban planning. The group from the EPP is talking about simplified and efficient cohesion policies, but they have to be transparent. And I'd like to ask the committee how they're going to guarantee that the member states will give the final data, ensuring transparency in the management of these funds, given that the member states will be able to choose them when using the available funding for the cohesion policy. And I'd like to know whether the Commission has traced any program to guarantee or ensure that a sufficient part of these funds will be aimed at the building of the essential social housing.
Procedure. We have maximum 2 minutes for each member, and we start with Mrs. Kalinets from Regi and DPP.
Merci, President.
Thank you, Chair. Housing is a competency of the member states, but has a European framework covering it as well. Thank you for these specific examples from Croatia and from the Basque country, which align with the principles which we have outlined in the Special Committee on Housing. These are vital issues, and what we need is a real strategy to ensure the correct use of the cohesion funds and the next generation funds. So we're looking at 15 million euros, at the next session, and we need to ensure that these are spent correctly. The Commissioner responsible for energy and housing has presented how they will be working with the EIB on a platform. It is good that representatives from DG Regio and the EIB are here today. Can we hear more on this platform and what work you are doing to engage private partners to ensure that funds are correctly spent, because we are running out of time. Thank you, Chair.
India from Ample and S&D.
Thank you, Chair. Bueno, yo en primer lugar agradecer.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the experts who have appeared here at a very important moment in this Parliament, to discuss the housing problem from a social point of view, but also a position of territorial cohesion. So at this point, I would like to ask a question to the advisor from the Basque government. Europe is looking at a great demographic challenge, and I'd like to know which good practices are you carrying out in housing policy, which is connected with this intergenerationality and the solution of housing for young people so they can become more emancipated, which is a problem you have mainly in the Basque region, but also for the elderly to combat loneliness and that they can have housing that allows them to be independent and yet safe for most of their time, of their lifespan. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Vielen Dank auch.
Thank you. Thank you to the experts as well. Thank you for your input. When Novak spoke about young people, this was something which is particularly of importance to me. Young people are staying at home for longer because it's not possible for them to rent flats. They can't become independent and they're not fulfilling their potential as a result of this. I'm particularly interested in young people living in rural areas, that they have the opportunity to decide how they want to live their future, how they're going to find a job. In the Regi Committee, we talk a lot about the right to stay. The right to stay means that those living in rural areas have the opportunity to live good lives, to live in their own flats and houses, to build their own future. From my point of view, looking at the rural areas where I live, I've visited many of them, and we're seeing situations where housing is being pulled down. And this is often happening because there is not enough infrastructure, not the right infrastructure in rural areas. So we need to make rural areas attractive. We need to be building housing, of course, but we need to establish the infrastructure, the framework, so that it is possible for people to move to these areas and live good lives. So this is important. I really want to underscore this. And this is something which we need to pay attention to. Of course, it's also important that housing remains public property and not everything is privatized. The result of this, if we don't do this, is that prices are driven up, and we need to think also about who decides who gets a flat or somewhere to live and who doesn't. And this is why we need to support local authorities. This is another important point which I wanted to underscore. Thank you.
Hirauta Vidal from Ample Committee and Patriots.
Muchas gracias. Como bien.
Thank you. As you know, the Basque Council is looking at housing, and access to housing in normal situation is basically a fantasy for most Spanish young people. However, the model you defend depends for its possibility to have constant interventions. In future, we have to look at financial possibilities. However, this is a point of view that does not look at the market. Now, I don't believe this entirely, but it's also very far from reality. The government of your party, if I'm not mistaken, you talk about this principle of building massively protected housing in Spain. And you're talking about this, but we haven't built even one. Your model is a question of intervening, putting a cap on rents, many regulations. So these are obstacles, tolerance for or do you prefer to increase the offer of housing available by liberalising land and reducing the administrative barriers at all levels, starting from the state administration down to the local, with the reduction of taxes on housing? And I'm asking you this because I've heard from both sides in your intervention. So I would like you to go a bit further in depth this. Which model are we talking about? Thank you.
Mr. Muloi from Regi Committee and Renew.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the experts for their contribution this morning. Affordable housing is one of the most pressing challenges facing our communities across the European Union, and it's a challenge that's particularly acute in rural areas like my own constituency, the Midlands Northwest of Ireland. In many rural areas we face a double challenge. On the one hand, young people are leaving because they cannot find suitable housing near their work and the services, and on the other hand, those who want to return are held back by a local property market that often does not cater for their needs. We need to see more flexibility within the ERDF and the cohesion funds to directly support affordable housing projects, particularly in rural regions where market-driven solutions have failed. However, it is not only rural areas that face this challenge, it can be also acute in urban areas. Cohesion policy has a vital role to play in addressing this challenge, Chair. We must support local authorities to build and renovate affordable housing. We must fund affordable housing projects to ensure that our citizens have access to safe, quality accommodation. We must promote energy-efficient housing to help tackle energy poverty in the community. We must also expand eligibility for housing investment. The current capacity to use EU funding is far too narrow, and the funding envelope is just far too small. However, funding alone is not the key issue, not the only issue. We must cut through red tape and simplify access to cohesion funds for housing projects. Local authorities and housing bodies often struggle with complex requirements, and we need to reduce these barriers so that funds can reach communities. And colleagues, this morning as Vice Chair of the Housing Committee of this Parliament, I also want to appeal to you. I say it is crucial that affordable housing is integrated with broader regional development strategies. Investing in housing without improving transport links and local services will not deliver for our communities. Boosting affordable housing supply through cohesion policy is not just about bricks and mortar, Chair. It's about keeping communities together, supporting rural revitalisation and ensuring that no region is truly left behind.
Thank you. Mr. Gordon Bosanac from Regi Committee and Greens Party.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to focus on what can we do now and how can we act fastly. And I'm thanks for Ms. Novak intervention and explanation how Croatia did changes in the midterm review to prioritize the housing, which is now open space for all the member states to prioritize the housing in the midterm review of cohesion policy. We will wait and see how many member states actually will do that. I hope all of them will do it, so they will confirm what we are saying here, that, the crisis is here. But my question is also, to what extent this midterm review was open to the consultations for the regions and the cities, because it was really a short window. And I'm not aware if the cities and the regions across Europe were aware that now is the chance to prioritize the housing within the cohesion policy. And the second question is also related to the fact that up to date, as it was said, we had an opportunity to use the cohesion policy for social housing primary, which means that we've been mostly using ERDF fund. But now we are talking not only about the social needs, which should be protected and should stay integrated everywhere, but now we have to make a step further, also to refer on the affordable housing, so to include those who are not socially vulnerable, but they have a need for housing. And to do that, I think we'll need more space in the cohesion policy, because now in the midterm review, the states were able to reorganize the money from ERDF. But as far as I understand, you were not allowed to touch the cohesion fund, because the Article 7, paragraph 5 of cohesion fund explicitly forbids investments in affordable housing. It allows for investments, of course, in energy efficiency, but not into the affordable housing, to build the new stock. So my question also to you is, would it be helpful for the regional authorities and national authorities also to open the cohesion fund for this kind of funding, to change Article 7, paragraph 5, something what we as a parliament can do in the forthcoming debate? Those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mrs. Gomez from S&D and Ample Committee.
Muito obrigada. Bom dia a todos. Quero, antes de mais, agradecer.
Firstly, I would like to thank you for this debate, and I would like to report about a major issue which I'm concerned with. Yesterday, it was reported in Portugal all day that 200 people are living in impossible conditions. It was explained that the government is not responsible for the housing crisis. But if the government and the EU, if none of them are responsible, then who is responsible? Are we going to just leave our citizens to their fate? Something needs to be changed. There was a good example in Portugal around the Recovery and Resistance Fund. Over 2 billion euros was given to housing development by the Portuguese government, but this is just a drop in the ocean. Furthermore, to what Madam Novak said, in rural areas, we need to prioritize acting, but it's important that the construction of housing takes place in correspondence with infrastructure, for example, transport infrastructure, because otherwise people won't be able to stay in rural areas. I worked on the report for 2027 and I brought this experience. Recovery and resistance funds are used, but he's talking about a sustainable strategy and not simply a Marshall Plan. I signed a declaration recently where we demanded a Marshall Plan. Maybe we can make the use of cohesion funds more flexible. We shouldn't forget about the homeless. Without housing, there is no democracy, and we want to build up democracy.
From EPP.
Thank you, Chair. As an EPP coordinator in the Committee of Housing Crisis, I warmly welcome this discussion addressing the urgent matter of affordable housing. What we need are strategic, targeted investments under cohesion policy, and we need a quick reaction. We need a reaction now. So, as the Member States have the unique opportunity in the midterm review of the cohesion programs to increase the funds for housing, I'm very especially glad to hear today that my home country, Croatia, is very aware of the housing problem and sees the cohesion policy as the part of the solution. So the cutting of the red tape, simplifying permitting procedures, and increasing cooperation between public and the private sector are necessary to boost housing supply promptly. So finally, we need to flexibilize cohesion policy and responsive to diverse local needs, empowering national, regional and local authorities to deliver real housing solution. And my question is to Ms. Iva Novak. You have mentioned today that you find a cohesion policy that is a good ground for development. What would be your suggestion for the housing? Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Serrano Sierra from S&D and the Regi Committee.
Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Madam Novak and Mr. Chasso for their very comprehensive reports. I agree with both of them that the problem of access to housing is really condemning a whole generation, and it's throughout the EU. But this situation is especially very critical in the rural areas. The lack of housing offers is one of the main reasons which leads to young people leaving their villages and their towns, and this makes it very difficult from the demographic point of view. And this case, there's not just one recipe. We can't have one antidote. There are rural areas where you don't have accessible housing, but in tourist areas where you do have housing, but it goes to tourists and are very expensive. My area is a mountain tourist area with one of the highest second homes. The houses offered are at exorbitant prices, and many have to accept to live in a trailer, in a caravan. So I would like to ask you, how do you think that the cohesion policy can offer solutions and stimulate the offer by bearing in mind the specific characteristics of each individual area?
Dostalova from Patriots and Regi Committee.
Děkuji za slovo, pane.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, Chair. I will try to be brief. First of all, I would like to thank very much for organizing this hearing today, because I believe that this exchange of views at the moment when we have the crisis of affordable housing is very important. So many thanks to both speakers. And I have two questions perhaps, because most things have been said by other colleagues. First, I would like to know, in your countries, how did you manage to handle the rules for state aid rules and debt barriers for large cities? Because for us, it would be really useful to know what specific legal proposals should be submitted by the European Commission to help member states. And my second question, I was interested to hear that one of the issues in both of these countries is lack of investment housing or housing where people do not live. So how about some changes of taxation? Did you do some changes of taxation for these housing units? Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Miranda from Greens and Regi Committee.
Muchas gracias, presidente.
Thank you, Chair. This week, the councillor at my party in Cabanas has said that, written to me, saying that his town, there are 16 rentals for 22 households. Now, for a young person that is only earning 1,200 euros a month, can't afford to buy there. And we're told in another area that there's 49% of households that are houses that are empty. Or last week, at the end at Santiago de Compostela, at the end of the Camino, the Basque countries, the Camino goes through Croatia and many countries, and you see how this influences the tourist housing. So I would like to ask the rapporteurs, these initiatives in areas with less than 100,000 inhabitants, towns that are struggling to survive, it's the main concern that most of the European citizens have. And this is the first concern in Galicia. For instance, the regulation of the use of housing in residential buildings that was done in Santiago, which is so innovative and puts a limitation to the rentals that were mentioned in the report on accessible housing. So this Parliament must legislate, and it have to make the cohesion funds more flexible, but we must also bear in mind the effects of massive tourism, of speculation, because over years it's been the working classes that have had to pay for this, because they can't access a home and they can't even rent.
Ms. Berna from ECR and the Regi Committee.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you. I will speak as Shadow Rapporteur of the file on cohesion policy and housing and as a member of the House Committee. First of all, I'd like to thank you for this discussion and for having had a joint discussion, for having involved the House Committee as well with the Chair. I think that one of the problems that we've all mentioned in our various discussions is that we don't have a global view as to this problem, a harmonized view throughout the member states, because a lot of the responsibility is in the hands of the national governments, but a lot of experiences, such as the ones we mentioned today, probably we see that we don't have a real picture of all the situations, both of good practices or state of the art, when you look at the member states on the housing emergency. Who has greater needs? Who needs a type of activity rather than another? In the House Committee, we very quickly audited both the European Bank and Commissioner Fito and Commissioner Bergen, who have said something, when looking at the size of the investment, they've given some hope on the commitment of the Commission. However, I think an important thing we could do is find a solution to have a general type of causes. And I'd like to thank the colleagues who have voted a pilot project that I submitted and was submitted for accessible, sustainable housing building, and so that it could be set up, which is that of supplying, identifying and mapping and creating an archive, the possibility of having a general overview of the problem, and then we can again go with better knowledge with the Regi Committee, the work we're doing here in the House Committee, and of course those who are following it in the EMPLA Committee. We can have the possibility of at last having a general overview, and we can really pinpoint what we're trying to do in our policies, not just according to our assessments, but when we look at objective data. Thank you.
From Regi Committee.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair, dear colleagues. What are we expecting from this plan? It's dictated by a punitive idea around ecology. Like for the increase for the energy market and banning combustion engines for 2035, the EU is heading towards degrowth, which is not considering the economic and social reality of the citizens of its member states. These are citizens that we barely even recognize anymore. There are increased standards, and this is only going to worsen the housing crisis and reduce the amount of construction and renovation. The EU is trying to create a state aid plan. I will add that housing is not under the competence of the EU. Once again, we are witness to a creeping of the scope of centralizations of the EU. When it comes to housing, the European Commission is looking to, following from health and defence, they're looking to gain a greater competence. The Commission is abusively taking in greater competences. This is to the detriment of member states and democracy and the subsidiarity principle. So I would like to raise the alarm around all of the attacks on the sovereignty of member states. Thank you.
Left and Regi Committee.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ, κύριε Πρόεδρε. Καταρχήν θέλω να ευχαριστήσω τους ομιλητές.
Firstly, I would like to thank all the speakers and for everything that they told us at this debate. It's important that we cover the needs of citizens. This is currently not the case, and at a European level we need to do something. Housing is a fundamental right for all citizens, but unfortunately we're seeing that it's become a privilege for many citizens. In my country, Greece, I must say that there is a heightened crisis. It affects Greeks. Many Greeks are spending over 35% of their income on housing. So I have some questions. Firstly, which policies or finance instruments do you believe will be useful to ensure that housing is appropriate and affordable, especially in island regions, in tourist regions? Secondly, there is lots of insecurity. This is a major obstacle for the investment from the Development Fund. It's important for decent and affordable housing, so I would like to know what proposal you would suggest for reducing these obstacles to investment. And my final question is around the renovation of existing housing. This is an important part of the Green Deal. How can we ensure that this investment in renovating these housing is affordable for households who have lower or middle incomes? This is for the next MFF. Thank you very much.
Aristopoli, we finish here the catch-eye procedure. I will now give the floor to both Mrs. Novak and Mr. Ichaso, each for 5 minutes approximately.
Zahvaljujem se na svim pitanjima koja su.
Thank you for all the questions that you have asked. I think this is a very concrete discussion, and it will probably last longer than it has lasted in the last year. I think that a lot of this can be done by national states, and especially together with the European Union. Of course, we cannot always look towards the European Union that is going to finance ourselves. We also have to take care of it ourselves. How? How to do it? Depending on the specific needs of a specific area. And therefore, one solution is not one size fits all, and this is something that we have to recognize. That's why we need very detailed mapping. We cannot start activities if we don't recognize well the situation in the field. When we talk about what the cohesion policy could adapt to, I can give an example that is related to climate tagging. All the codes that contribute towards the climate 4 have a climate tagging 0. What does it mean in practice? This means that we have less possibilities to front load, to load or to earmark additional funds for housing, because then we are going to impact the allocation of RDF of 30%. We also have to fulfill other things related to the cohesion policy, and this is one of the basic elements that we have to fulfill. Therefore, we have to adapt this segment for the future. When we talk about rural areas, Croatia is doing many activities to activate business, ensure connectivity. Therefore, we have an integrated territorial program that includes elements of industrial transition that goes towards less developed areas. We have a segment for our islands. We have a segment for integrated territorial investment. We do a lot in order to use these territorial features. Also, when we talk about the midterm review, our elements have already been shared with all the representatives of our common committee, monitoring committee. That means that they had become aware of what midterm review is. Therefore, we have to do this if we have to have a good discussion about midterm review. When we talk about young people and when we speak about young families and their needs, we mustn't stop thinking about the elderly. Within our national plan for housing care, we will also include the elderly. So with the program 65+, we are going to consider how we can ensure better housing for our elderly and also our citizens that with the limited mobility. We have to think that we are all going to become old and we have to address their needs as well. So what I would like to say is that we have to work together on these elements related to this crisis, the housing crisis in the European Union. The activation of these empty flats is something that is going to ensure a quicker action, because we don't have to work on so many documentation for citizens. We are going to reduce the CO2 emissions, and when we include the renewable sources of energy, then we can also ensure those elements that are needed for Fit for 55. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ichazo.
Muchas gracias. Creo que
Thank you. I think this is very interesting. Thank you for all the questions and for all your contributions. Now, Marcos Ross was asking what type of conditions could we put for the future funds. Well, the EU could have available to help the member states and the regions to improve the quantity of the stock of housing. I think it's essential when we're talking about results. We all here have a bit of interest in housing. We know that it's important, and we need to have a good amount of housing, starting from sustained investments over time, and to ensure that this were always public and protected. There are regions in my country too, in Spain, where there's public money which is invested into new housing, and then it is left to degrade, and then it is bought up, and then it is no longer protected. And this is one of the conditions. We have to ensure that it remains in public hands. On the other hand, Estela Galan was considering housing as a fundamental right. Well, yes, we agree, but this implies the market. We're not trying to cause fear. We are regulating the market in such a way that we manage. We do it already with necessary elements, necessary goods, and so is housing. And we've got to guarantee the needs of the owners, but also protect the renters. Now here, we've got to, it's not a question of a constant or chronic investment. No, it's a question of demand and offer. When we say that the times are so long, we need this time to protect us, where we have to regulate the market. It doesn't have to be forever, but until we manage the whole system, the idea is to leave the protected sector. But what is essential at this point is to increase the offer, but it needs time, and you have to regulate the prices. Now, you were talking about good practices that we could offer. Now, the modern of the housing we're talking about allows for a greater use of the land, but not just for residential property, but also to manage land, which is necessary for equipment, and there too we can also have housing. These can be intergenerational for young people, for instance, and there we also talked about this to generate conditions that encourage the they can become independent, and it has to be a maximum of 5 years, but affordable. And the same should be for the elderly as well. In exchange for moving into these properties, they could put their own property on the market for regular rental. And in this case, we can have a general benefit for the whole of society. Madam Gomez, I seem to understand that she was talking about the need to have an intensive plan, but I thought more than a plan, a short plan such as that of the Resilience and Recovery Plan, what we need is investment sustained over time, not a lot of money in a short period of time, but rather something that we can maintain the investment to accompany society and have these new homes. Now, Madam Serrano was also talking about another interesting element, making it more intensive. We have that in the large cities and the suburbs, but also in small areas that can be tourist areas. You talked about Aragon, but also the Basque countries. We have coastal areas, Funaya, Licaizio, Devia, which are small towns with a strong tourist pressure, which is being influenced because it doesn't have enough homes or housing available for its young people. And so we can put it without giving any further licenses for tourist rentals because it's incompatible. These towns have to carry out a study, and we can contribute of the limits that these small towns have to deal with because they can't fulfill all this demand without putting at risk the housing situation for its own citizens.
I'll give the floor to the representative of the European Economic and Social Committee, the European Commission and the European Investment Bank. Mrs. Carmen Barrera from the European Economic and Social Committee for maximum 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Las inversiones en vivienda asequible y sostenible.
Investing in accessible housing has to be a strategic element, and since 2027 we have to look at accessible housing and social housing with innovation in parallel. The proposal of doubling the investment in accessible housing is a significant opportunity, but to maximize its impact it is necessary to have innovative investments and strategic investment within the cohesion policy, because this can't solve the deficit of funding for housing, but it should be an area for coordinating and mobilizing further funds with the bank and through the EU platform, and in order to take advantage of the cohesion funds. This represents a promising solution, but it requires many simplifications and standardizations in order to increase its acceptance. Within the policy for investment, we must increase the potential to deal with the significant amount of housing necessary, which is limited at the moment. You need more investment than what is usually available in the traditional market, so the bank becomes an ideal partner for a cohesion policy, the instrument which allows us to have the funds to which will be reinvested can lead to accessible housing. And this is innovative financial instruments are necessary, and this can also contribute, but we must ensure that it does not lead to greater increases in prices. The next MCP has promising possibilities for increased accessible housing, especially if we can align it with the structural reforms that are necessary, combining investments in the construction of housing with reforms and with the permits which are granted, rules on the land use and state regulations. The EU could also look at the limitations of the offer and a deficit in funding in this way. A reformed state in investment can have a specific impact by giving greater flexibility with the development of mixed investment, which the rules at the moment are limiting. However, the implementation systems are significant because conditioning this to specific reforms could cause bottlenecks in regions that are leading to these changes. The housing market varies very much throughout the EU, and a standardized and the prescription for standardized reforms can be a problem. But looking at income, this gives us doubts as the parameters needed, because they have to be developed in a longer period of time than the cycles and the programs available, which causes the need for having rapid solutions instead of sustainable solutions. The next MCP could look at this problem by recognizing housing as a question of economic competitiveness, integrating it within the Competitiveness European Fund, which we look at the intervention of housing for the pressure of the labor market, the development of the innovation ecosystem, and the results in the region will lead to an adequate balance between the necessary reforms, flexible investments which recognize the dual role of housing and social cohesion and economic development, guaranteeing that the limitations to housing do not touch the European competitiveness at the world level.
Deputy Director for DG Regio.
Chair, thank you very much. Honourables Langen-Siepen and Tinagli made very clear at the beginning of this conversation why the housing has become such a big concern and a big priority at the European level, so much that President von der Leyen presented political guidelines last summer to this House, indicating housing as one of her key priority. The Executive Vice President Fitto was in front of the Housing Special Committee at the beginning of March, and he made very clear, one, that the EU budget is already doing a lot in the housing sector. More than 30 billion euro are spent between the Recovery and Resilience Facility and cohesion funding. He made also very clear that he will intend to follow up on the promise of the President to double funding for the housing sector by injecting liquidity through cohesion policy, and he will put forward ideas on how to do it, possibly with some legislative adjustment to reflect some of the concern that you have expressed in terms of flexibility, incentives, and definition of the scope of what can be done in the housing sector. And finally, he made very clear that he intends to use the midterm review as the moment in which we will need to engage with the authorities managing the structural funds very seriously to ensure that resources are shifted and priority is given to housing investment. That said, let's be clear, that will also very much depend on the willingness of those authorities to reinforce investment on housing. And this will happen over the next few months. Let me just conclude by pointing to sharing three reflections. The first is on the territorial dimension of that was mentioned by Honourable Tinagli at the beginning of this discussion. While it's very clear that we do need a much stronger European framework and what some of you called a strong multi-level coordination between level of governments in this area, at the end of the day, housing markets are local. And decisions on what to do, where to do it, is very much in the hands of local authorities. And there's another reason that some of you mentioned, and this is my second reflection, is that is at the local level that you can organize the integration of policies that is much needed. Because it's very difficult to imagine that we will invest in the housing sector without at the same time thinking of what this will imply in terms of accessibility, in terms of mobility, in terms of the impact on the waste and wastewater sector, in terms of access to basic services, whether education or health. And the final reflection, and here I close, is that we also need to think of how to use the funding available not only to invest, but also to favor those reforms that are needed for the housing market to function effectively, because sometimes reforms are as important as the money available. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Luciana Tomozei, Head of Division at the European Investment Bank.
Dear chairs, honorable members, thank you very much for inviting the EIB to join this public hearing on housing. Investing in affordable housing is both a social responsibility and the foundation underpinning any productive economy. It is about giving citizens the right to live, work, study where they choose, and this is something that the honourable members of the House mentioned several times today. This is also one of the key points that our President, Nadia Calviño, made a couple of days ago in the annual meetings of the EIB in Luxembourg at the EIB Group Forum. The second message that she passed is the key importance of partnerships. According to our latest investment survey that we also published a couple of days ago, the need to increase the supply of affordable housing is very urgent. The data is clear coming from this report that the EU must build an additional 1 million new homes this year to cope with the demand and renovate additional 5 million units per year. The annual investment gap overall is estimating at 270 billion. To fill this gap, we need to mobilize investments, public and private, from national and EU level. We cannot afford to do the same. We need to increase the scale and the scope of these investments. And precisely this is what we are planning to do with our action plan for affordable housing that was also mentioned a couple of times. It builds on 9 months of extensive consultation with stakeholders from the housing sector. What we plan to do is to double the financing to 6 billion euros for the housing sector, and we also plan to expand the offer for the whole housing sector value chain, to step up the construction, but also to step up the renovation, the energy efficiency renovation in buildings. And for that, it's very key that we will work in partnerships. In fact, we are very much already working with the European Commission, with member states, cities and regions, and PBIs, or national promotion banks, which are very important, to leverage the public resources, the public financing, but from national and EU funds, and of course, very importantly, the private financing. And in this respect, also we would like to share a couple of reflections on how cohesion policy plays a key role for this sector. First, as it was mentioned just now by Nicola De Michelis and before by the chair of the House Committee and other honourable members, housing is a local challenge. So any solution needs to work at the local level. No one size fits all. We need to have granular, also scalable solutions, but we need to tailor to the local needs, like it was mentioned, also given the other policies that need to be taken into consideration. So the place-based approach of cohesion policy is key to target these investments to the local needs. The second way in which cohesion policy plays a key role is via the EU grants that can be available and can constitute that public support needed to de-risk investments and to bring also the private investments, private sector in. So financial instruments, as it was mentioned, play a smart role in this. And at EIB, we are already working very closely with the European Commission on new models of financial instruments for the housing sector to maximize the blending of the different sources of funds, including from the EU, EIB, national promotional banks, etc. We have been doing this very efficiently in the past in sectors like energy efficiency, and we think that it's high time to do this for the housing sector as well. And the last reflection is that cohesion policy can also help us expand the support to other areas in the EU, for instance, where the regulatory frameworks are not yet in place and where we can provide technical assistance to these cities or regions or member states, because we need to also help build capacities there where currently it's not in place. And we have been providing support to cities in Croatia, Latvia, also Czechia and Slovakia, and we can do much more. more, also via the portal that was launched at the AB Group Forum, together with the European Commission, part of the Action Plan for Housing, a portal that wants to group all the support available for more homes and better homes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we will move on to the second session entitled Improving Access to Adequate, Decent and Affordable Housing for All. And first I would like to give the floor to Ms. Alina Bratu to share her experience as an architect on the needs for affordable housing. Madame Bratu is a Romanian national expert. Dear colleagues, please be respectful, and if you have to leave, do it quietly. As chief architect of Sector 2 of the municipality of Bucharest, she coordinated the activities of the development of the zonal urban plan and the integrated urban development strategy of Sector 2. Madame Bratu, you have now the floor for maximum 10 minutes, and people who have to leave, please leave the room. You can chit-chat outside, please. We respect our guests here, and we are running out of time, 30 minutes late already. Just for the transparency. And now, Madam, please, the floor is yours. 10 minutes.
Thank you. Doamnelor și domnilor, membri ai Parlamentului.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of the European Parliament, dear guests. I appreciate the fact that in the first two slides we had a series of statistical data regarding the needy persons and the costs of living at European level. Given the limited time, please look at them in the presentation I have sent you. But to sum up things, we can for surely say that 1.5 of the population of the European Union, meaning more than 95 million persons, are in a vulnerable category with a direct impact on the need for housing. This aspect is in direct proportion with the low average level of income, but also with the growth of housing prices from the last 14 years. In the cause-effect category of the described situations, I mentioned magnetism, urban sprawl, bureaucracy, and low funds. In order to facilitate the access to affordable housing and decent houses, we have implemented in the last 25 years more measures based on incentives. For instance, in Romania, we have the first house, the new house, Law 15 of 2003, Law 114 from 1996, and the national, the NRR, Romanian NRR, regarding housing for youngsters, the European non-reimbursement financing plan. In the programs in Romania, we have a series of programs dedicated to young people, 35 at max, with no housings, but also a local authority which builds houses, the National Agency for Housing, on a piece of land given by the local authority. What inspires us? The government in Singapore for their strategy, land acquisition, strategic planning, and land preservation for future development. The government in Singapore has built in the last 80 years more than 1 million housing units in order to have a housing space for each citizen. Propotsdam, it's a public company which manages 17,000 apartments out of the 85,000. It has a contract with the city in order to ensure that at least 50% of the housings from each housing unit are social housing. The U.S. local authorities for less bureaucracy, for less regulations concerning social housings. And I'm speaking of the density bonus from San Diego, the accelerated permitting process in Santa Fe, or the tax incentives in Philadelphia. Social City, Germany, and Barcelona right to housing and housing plan programs. When it comes to the stages for affordable housings, we are dealing with a roadmap. The first stage is the initiative of the European Parliament to be a support pillar by mechanisms and common instruments, adequate and sustainable. We invested the European Investment Fund with European Investment Bank, public consortiums and private consortiums, which can contribute by loans with low interest rate, grants, or by effectively building housing spaces. And we have a committee, a group operative, and the unique pan-European platform. Of course, we ask ourselves which are the best, the perfect solutions. Without any rhetorics, we cannot speak about perfect solutions, but we can speak about improvable solutions based on best practices and innovation, on respecting the decision autonomy of each member state on the specific features and needs. The third step, we focus on establishing a set of issues identified at point A, but also a set of possible solutions identified at point B. On the next 3 slides, you will see a few of the difficulties and the solutions thereof, which can be extended and adapted depending on the specificity of each member state. One of the issues is to identify the best for the best actors, and we find public companies, local authorities, state-owned companies, public-private partnership, and groups of entrepreneurs. Another difficulty is related to identifying suitable land for such investments and available lands. We have private land with public-private partnership or joint ventures, and public land where we can use former industrial areas, former farms out of agricultural use, former military bases out of use, and lands that can be expropriated or purchased for public use. And the second version, if there is no available land, we can use the existing built residential stock. We can strengthen buildings and adding floors if needed. We can reconstruct buildings whose restoration would cost more and increasing the height levels. And last but not least, converting office buildings into housing, considering the new tendencies of remote working.
Now, it's difficult to involve the private sector. That's another issue when it comes to that it's not attractive. The state can interfere even without funding by providing incentives such as a bonus or cutting down on the number of parking lots and other urban planning options. When the state wants to be a partner, it can also have a contribution by subsidies or public facilities or investment funds. Bureaucracy is another issue. As we well know, time is money, and one of the solutions is the one-stop shop or digitalizing and using digital twin solutions with a single document that should be provided at the end. When it comes to the high costs and the high prices, whether this is the result of the lack of efficiency of certain policies, we can identify several solutions. For instance, centralized auctions with small prizes or volunteering issues or persons who provide community work, and also programs for immigrants. We can also use modular constructions as well as prefabricated recycled materials, because this would boost the circular economy. Moreover, you can see a few solutions in order to attract the private sector. For instance, the density bonus, public versus private lands, as well as PPPs on private lands. They all have a role in drawing private investments. Regardless of the option, it should be based on estimates of the needs and the value of the land, the value of the construction, taxes, the area, the number of housing units, and so on. Last but not least, using AI as a public policy instrument. This is based in the AI Act and on the study by the European Commission in 2024 on the potential for AI to improve public services throughout the EU, and it is also based on best practices in Los Angeles and Singapore. The proposal is based on 3 pillars: using AI in order to anticipate the time when certain people can end up in financial difficulty because of certain social or economic conditions, using data provided by public authorities. And then we can expand this analysis and anticipate the type of students, for instance, that might end up as needs. And we should overlap this with a set of public policies. And AI can help suggest direct measures to improve the situation before the economic conditions have an impact on the status of these people. So authorities can provide housing for these people. Another solution might be the digital twin, such as the one in Singapore, in order to have virtual building. This would help planning and monitoring the construction site. The final objective is to have reduced costs for construction and maintenance. And last but not least, AI assistance for potential beneficiaries, whether we speak of vulnerable categories or other types of beneficiaries. We need authorities to step into the AI era. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we move forward to our second expert. It's Madame Laia Segura. Madame Segura is a right to energy campaigner at Friends of the Earth Europe, working at the intersection of the right to energy and housing, advocating for decent, affordable and energy efficient homes for all. She coordinates the Build Better Lives campaign and the Right to Energy Coalition, both being multi-stakeholders alliance that unite trade unions, anti-poverty groups, social housing providers, NGOs, health organizations and city networks, among others. Madame Segura, now the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. Yes, my name is Laia, and I'm gonna share a bit of the work that we are doing. So I wanted to start today by framing the discussion to steer political ambition grounded in the principle that homes are for people, not profit. But the reality is that millions of families are currently being pushed into housing precarity and energy poverty. And this is the direct outcome of a system that has prioritized profits over people's fundamental needs for decades. And we are reaching a breaking point. Currently, there's 1.3 million people that are experiencing homelessness, and for a million more, keeping decent living conditions is a growing struggle. Over the past decades, house prices have soared by 48% and rents by 18%, while electricity costs have skyrocketed by 45%. And this surge in cost is made worse by the fact that 75% of our homes are energy inefficient. The result is 47 million Europeans trapped in energy poverty, not able to afford neither housing nor their essential utilities to cover for their basic needs. And here utility bills are an unavoidable part of housing costs, just like rent or mortgage payments. When energy costs are too high, a home becomes unaffordable. Doesn't matter if the rent seems reasonable or the mortgage payments are reasonable. And in 2023, 10% of urban households and 7% of rural households were forced to spend over 40% of their income on housing costs. This means that unaffordability of homes is not just a city problem, but it is also affecting rural communities too. And the result of these families spending 40% of their income in cost is that they only have 60% left for any other expense that they have in their daily life. It means education, transport, food, anything, which forces them to make impossible choices, and it deepens our society's inequalities. So we see that millions of households are stuck in homes that are poorly insulated and ill-equipped for the worsening extreme weather events, homes that are unbearably hot in summer and freezing cold in winter. And these are forcing residents into soaring energy bills while also increasing carbon emissions and reliance on fossil fuels. We need homes for people. Yes, we need more homes for people. But building new homes alone will not deliver to the challenge. So we must address this multifaceted and interconnected crisis through multiple angles. And today I'm here to speak and then to put the focus into one of those. That is putting on the spotlight the millions of existing homes that remain poorly insulated, in disrepair, are underutilized, that leave people trapped in housing precarity and energy poverty. So the question is how to support and ensure people have the tools to escape this situation. And one of the answers is by facilitating fair, affordable and accessible renovations for their homes. Renovations can be a real catalyst for affordable housing if they are done fairly and sustainably, as they can help households to reduce energy costs while also ensuring housing stability and protecting the residents from displacement. And then the million-dollar question is how to deliver a socially just renovation that helps improve housing affordability then. Well, I have a long list of recommendations and I aim to go through them. So first, by prioritizing deep energy efficient upgrades in the worst performing buildings, so to deliver lasting benefits to low income and vulnerable households. Because lower energy bills, better living conditions and long-term housing security are within reach if we ensure renovations are targeted, accessible and protected by strong social safeguards. We need a people-centered approach because policies must be designed to meet the needs of the different communities, regional households, taking into account the needs of both urban and rural communities, ensuring that everyone can remain in their homes if that is what they want, and ensure that they benefit from better insulation, clean energy, and improved comfort. And to make this a reality, we must strengthen public authorities with technical support and involve trade unions, civil society, and local actors to ensure renovations are implemented effectively and fairly, with households being supported throughout the process with one-stop shops. And this targeted support will look different for rural and urban communities, with urban focused support being about...
Excuse me, madam, could you speak a bit slowly? The interpreters get in trouble right now. Sorry.
I've noticed that the Spanish speakers, we speak, the Spanish native speakers, we speak fast, sorry. So yes. Okay. But another key recommendation is to ensure that public investment is targeted into driving this transformation. Yes, public funding is limited, and to maximize its impacts, it needs to be directed into securing targeted funding for low-income households and designing financial schemes that account for different social and economic realities. There's the Social Climate Fund, ETS2 revenues, the cohesion funds. They all offer key pathways to support large-scale energy renovations, but we also need to go beyond, topping these funds with new measures, with the new MFF development, but also redirecting fossil fuel subsidies towards energy-efficient housing. This is also crucial to accelerate the shift towards a fair and sustainable future. This is our opportunity to turn home renovations into a tool for justice, ensuring affordability, protecting communities, and building a future where everyone has access to a safe, warm, and sustainable home. Because investing in home renovations means investing in people, in communities, and in a more resilient future for all. So we've been mentioning affordability a lot, but what do we actually mean with affordability? Because an affordable home is not a fixed cost, is not a percentage. It is about ensuring everyone has a roof over their heads that does not jeopardize their well-being. And to ensure that houses remain or become affordable after renovations, there are different measures that we can implement, and some examples for tenants specifically are rent caps after renovation or social housing renovation guarantees for social housing tenants. So we've seen that renovations are needed, that affordable renovations are possible, and now I'm also going to talk about how renovations are wanted. Because there's more and more people across the EU mobilizing to achieve their right to a safe, warm, and energy-efficient home. And one flagship example is Locataires Ensemble, is a federation of tenants in France, which currently has over 2,500 members that are actively calling for renovation, for lower rents, for lower energy bills, and for lower carbon. Because action needs to be taken to address the overlapping crisis of housing affordability, rising energy costs, and climate change. And the new energy and housing portfolio presents once-in-a-generation opportunity to transform Europe's housing stock in a way that prioritizes inclusion, dignity, and sustainability. I'm coming into an end with my intervention and I realized that, yes, I spoke super fast. But I wanted to bring your attention to the Build Better Lives campaign. This is an initiative launched by Friends of the Earth Europe and Climate Action Network that brings together nearly 100 organizations. And what we do is to strive to ensure renovations are a pathway for vulnerable households to access decent, affordable, and energy-efficient homes that don't cost us the earth. And what we are asking is for an enabling framework at the EU level that helps us achieve this goal. And our key demands are implementing an ambitious and socially implementation of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, coupling and strengthening the affordable housing initiative with adequate and targeted financing for renovation of the worst performing homes, and also ensuring technical assistance, multi-level governance, and support for the activation of actors at the local level. And to end my intervention, I also wanted to mention that I couldn't help but notice that the title of this session is Improving Access to Adequate, Decent and Affordable Housing, rather than ensuring this access. And actually this change in the wording is important. That it is crucial that our political ambition goes beyond mere improvements, as not to leave anyone behind. We really need to be committed to ensuring the right to housing for all. Let's make sure that we don't lose sight of our objective and that we take action to achieve fair, sustainable and resilient future. And you're in the right place at the right time to do so. So it's just a matter of taking the opportunity and picking up the right tools to build better lives for all. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And to complete our experts, let's now hear from Mr. Hans Dubois, Senior Research Manager at the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions. Mr. Dubois, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Yes, so there are great differences in unaffordability within member states, geographically and between population groups. For instance, based on whether people are new to the market and have access to social housing or not. Unaffordability depends on housing costs, but it also depends on income and expenditure needs, which depends on public coverage and of healthcare and childcare costs, for instance. Housing unaffordability can lead to various housing problems, which need to be considered jointly. They're in this framework: housing exclusion, insecurity, problematic housing costs, so being unable to pay for other things, other needs, due to housing cost, and housing inadequacy. Housing problems lead to great societal costs, as Eurofound calculated in the past. On housing exclusion, that includes homelessness, but also young people living longer with their parents. And when you look at the change, the increase in the proportion of young people living with their parents, it's very large in a short time. And it is in urban and in rural areas, by 2% points overall in just 5 years, which is large for such an issue. Now, when we move on to problematic housing costs, not every household spending 40% or more of their income the EU measure of housing cost overburden, reports problems making ends meet. Those with children, low income, and living in rural areas are more likely to do so. Now, with regard to housing inadequacy, private tenants, and especially those with low income, are at highest risk of all types of housing inadequacy problems which we mapped in our report, including energy efficiency. But it is important not to overlook people who own their homes without a mortgage, for instance, as well, which is a large group. At least 45% of all households, and in 17 member states, more than that, owns their home without a mortgage. And many are at risk of poverty, as can be seen in the graph on the right, the green bars being the situation in rural areas where this is much more common. They may not make rent or mortgage payments, but they do struggle with utility payments. So overall, of all households in rural area, 9% are outright owners who cannot keep their homes at adequate temperature. So they also need to be reached. Then the home can really not be seen independently of its surrounding area. In particular, many people, especially in rural areas, have poor access to public transport. Now, we mapped a broad spectrum of support measures on each of these dimensions, 4 dimensions of housing problems. Now, while they are very important for recipients, they also come with challenges. So, for instance, rent and ownership support can drive up prices, they can cause over-indebtedness, and they can be considered unfair due to non-take-up and fixed thresholds, age thresholds, for instance. If you're just a little bit older, you don't get it. Then social housing, yes, but it's scarce in most of the member states. And even where it is most in the member states, like Austria, Netherlands, where it's largest, there are long waiting lists. Now, some measures which can be highlighted with large potential are, of course, increased supply. But not only by building, also by renovating and reducing vacant dwellings. Often, though, they need to be renovated as well. Then it's key to have measures to reduce households' dependence on external energy purchasing, so insulation or solar panels. Better reach low-income groups, so they become more resilient to future price increases. And lastly, it is key to look beyond housing, so also at the surrounding areas and the financial situation of people, so with better and more secure employment and social protection. Thank you.
Thank you for keeping an eye on the time. For transparency, dear colleagues, we must leave that room in 30 minutes. And we have still a long list. But just for the transparency, interpreters will leave and next group needs that room. So please be aware of. But nevertheless, we will now open the floor for our members. And we start with the rapporteurs. If you could stick to 2 minutes instead of 3. I really appreciate it. And we start with Mr. Marcos Ros Sempere, SND, Rapporteur of an any report on the role of cohesion policy investment and resolving the houses crisis for the Regi Committee. Please, the floor is yours. 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I will try to adapt to 2 minutes. I will switch to Spanish. Gracias a los tres intervinientes.
I'd like to thank the 3 speakers I think it's quite indicative of everything the EU can do and everything we can actually do. It is necessary to have reforms. We'll have to look at our funds in the future. At the moment, we're talking about the social dimension. As far as I'm concerned, there's something that's very clear. We've worked over decades with something very clear, rules that sort of what was social housing, what was accessible housing. Social was protected and was carried out from the public sector and with the social fund, whilst the other people who were on the free market and they could afford to have housing, and with the possibility also of improving their homes only from the energy point of view. However, things have changed now. That clear difference between a vulnerable population and homeless has become now very blurred because the free market is pushing out thousands of citizens who are now becoming vulnerable because they cannot afford housing. We've got more people demanding housing and fewer people per household, so you need more housing. With the crisis of 2008, the new building was reduced, the speculation in the housing, especially in rentals, and there we have the whole problem of energy poverty. We're going to have to see that it's essential to increase the objectives. All the funds, the regional fund, social fund, the RFD fund, have to invest not only in the social housing, which is already covered, but investing in accessible housing and protected housing.
And now we move to EPP. Madame Elena Nevado del Campo.
Muchas gracias. Thank you. The problem of vulnerability in housing is connected with the significant increase in prices. According to Eurostat in Spain, we've seen that there's accumulation of 31% since 2018 in the costs of housing. Young people have no access. There's no way. So they're all vulnerable because their salary or their employability does not allow them to pay a rent in our country. So again, we'd like to pick this up. We're seeing how the member states are demanding from Europe solutions, urgent solutions, when many... I'd like to draw attention to the fact that we mentioned Barcelona. Barcelona, the housing problem is significant. 4,034 euros per square meter for an apartment. And that is really hitting the municipalities with a problem here because the cost of housing is incredible and it's a problem that is extending. Now, there's just a question I'd like to ask, which for us it's essential, though. In the rural areas, it's possible to make housing, accessible housing, attractive. Europe must invest in connectivity, for instance, in transport, because the problem is tied to that, to the vulnerability. If we concentrate on the population in the urban areas, they the prices go up, but the villages are becoming abandoned. So we've got to involve the rural world, and what you need there is transport connecting them.
Very on time. I'm so happy. Now we move to the Catch the Eye, and here, to be fair, I give you 1 minute, and we start. Please, yeah, we saw. No, who takes? Yeah, I know. Just to have it clear that there's. You have it, and we start with Madame Gesseni Regi, EPP. Please, yeah, here you are. 1 minute, please.
Köszönöm szépen. Köszönöm valamennyiüknek a munkát.
Thank you. I thank you for all the work you've undertaken. This is a very important area. Unfortunately, though, the situation we find ourselves in is disastrous. Looking both at the access to housing and also energy use, Probably this is largely due to the inaccessibility of EU resources. I would like to underscore the importance of competitiveness and the creation of jobs and the relationship which this has with building housing, and then the links in to environmental policy and water. These are essential areas. Looking at Hungary, in the central part of Hungary, this is a drought area, and you have to ask yourself whether it's even possible to live there. Regions need to identify priorities. Looking at vulnerable groups, women's, disabled people, and other groups, they need to get the resources.
Sí, muchas gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question to put it disagree with. The extreme right is critical in Europe, and here we're finding a solution: the promotion of households that are economically sustainable as a solution. These are the ones who benefit mainly the more in vulnerable families by protecting them from an important situation such as energy poverty. So I'd like to ask Rapporteur, Madame Segura, what do you think of that type of intervention in this Parliament? And we also referred the situation of Barcelona. I'd also ask colleagues, it's fine to talk, but we want to convert it into reality, and I'd like to talk about lowering the rental prices in Barcelona of 6.4% after having applied the law for housing, the Spanish law for housing, for 1 year.
Madame Teodorescu, ECR. Is not in the room. No problem. We will move forward to Renew. Mr. Maloli, sorry. Great.
Thank you, Chair.
1 minute.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our speakers from at this very interesting debate this morning from Romania and from Barcelona. In fact, I would address my first question perhaps to our architect from Romania. Your contribution was very, very interesting for me from one area in particular, looking at adequate, decent and affordable housing and affordable space. I would like to know your opinion, specifically with regard to new proposals which are now moving around Europe and in Ireland and elsewhere with regard to the density of developments. I see a proposal for a reduction in the minimum amount of garden space homes must have as part of a series of changes being sought in our country and in other countries in Europe, and particularly a move to a three-tiered approach to residential density, with densities of up to 35 dwellings per hectare in smaller towns and villages, densities of 35 to 50 per hectare in outer suburban and greenfield areas of cities and larger towns, and densities of at least 50 in more central and accessible urban locations. I'm wondering what your opinion indeed is of that, or indeed what the opinion of our Commission would be to such developments in future. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last speaker is from the left, Madame
Funchen. Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. I'll be very brief. Many of us here will have experience in local constituency offices and at the grassroots level of politics, where we see day to day the struggles that people face in relation to the housing situation and the housing crisis. I think it's really important that this doesn't become an item only at election time, but that we are constantly working to address the issues. Funding should be available at the local level through the use of the EIB and consistent access to cohesion policy. By giving economic might to local authorities, there is potential for them to contribute more effectively with less red tape. Therefore, I ask, does the panel agree that properly empowered local authorities are the key to solving the housing crisis? And do the panel agree that allowing simpler, more direct use of cohesion policy funding at this level can help alleviate the housing crisis? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And now we move forward, reply by the experts. We start with Madame Bratou and then Madame Segura. Each of you 3 minutes, please. Madame Bratou, you can start.
Thank you. Întrebarea privește
The question regards the densification policy Well, when it comes to my opinion on this, among all criteria related to facilitating access to affordable housing, this was one of the criteria. It does not mean that it can be applied everywhere. For instance, the density bonus. There are a series of cities and member states that want to apply other policies, maybe less parking lots. You have to have analysis and specific studies for each area. There may be specific areas where can apply this density bonus, which increases the density per square meter. In Ireland, they want to lower density, so this is a different aspect. When it comes to my opinion, every density bonus has to be applied based on specific studies. And if this is possible, I think that all criteria will be increased when it comes to affordability of housings, including reducing costs, taking into account the vertical development, which will always lead to lower costs. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we move forward to Madame Segura. 3 minutes, please.
Thanks. If that's okay, I'm gonna speak in Spanish because the question was asked in Spanish. Is that okay?
Sorry, yeah. I didn't hear you.
Thanks. No, yo quería comentar respecto.
I wanted to comment on comparing the costs of housing in the rural areas or in the suburbs even of a large city. This housing might have a low rent or the mortgage is less, but they become inaccessible. They're still not affordable because there's no connectivity, there's no transport, or there might not be jobs. So at that point, the truth is that it becomes inaccessible. And in order to answer the questions from MP Holmes, a household that is not energy efficient will never be accessible because the price of the cost of energy is very high. And again, to respond, I'd say that housing is a right and it should not be left to the market because we're seeing the results here. Millions of people who find themselves in poverty, energy poverty, and without access to housing. I think I've answered your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next, we will give the floor for remarks by Madame Ruud Pazaman, Director of DG Ample, European Commission. Madame, you have the floor for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to this debate. I will be very short. In the Commission, we started we have been working on the housing for some time. In DG Employment, in particular, looking at social housing and homelessness. We have established in 2021 a platform for fighting homelessness, and within the work of this platform is also the goal is to foster the housing first principle, which means helping homeless people to find a place to live that they can call theirs rather than moving from shelter to shelter, and then once they have a living place to solve their problems, because usually there are also other connected problems to homelessness. So this housing first principle has been very successful in Finland. We are pushing for it to be developed throughout Europe, but of course to be able to do that you also have to have houses in which to formerly homeless people can go. So, and through this, we're also working on increasing financing, notably via the InvestEU guarantee, which is used both by the EIB and by other implementing partners, and notably the Council of Europe Bank. And the Council of Europe Bank in particular is particularly active on the issue of homelessness. the housing crisis sort of goes down the chain. So, people that before could afford the house, they cannot afford anymore, and therefore people who were before perhaps in social housing end up homelessness. So it's a whole chain that needs to be addressed. The second point that I would like to mention is the issue of the Social Climate Fund. Indeed, discussing with member states, it's clear that there are two clear aspects on the housing crisis. One is the affordability, and one is the affordability also, but of the renovation of existing stocks. So no new builds and renovation of existing stocks, both are important. The Social Climate Fund is a new fund which will start operating this year, and which is about specifically about supporting the most vulnerable, given the impacts of the ETS2, which will start operating in 26. And it is exactly, one of the main purposes for which it will be used is the renovation of housing of the most vulnerable people. So it goes exactly in this direction. Having said that, I just pick up the point that my colleague Nicola De Michelis made before, that the problem cannot be seen in isolation, but it also is linked to the access to other services, like was mentioned before, public transport, schools, healthcare, etc. I stop there.
Thank you. And now we finally turn to Mr. Matthew Baldwin, Deputy Director General and Head of the Commission's Task Force on Housing. You have the floor for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chair, for giving us the floor as an extra special guest speaker on top of all the other Commission speakers you've had. 4 very quick points. Firstly, the Commission's appointment of the first ever EU Commissioner for Housing, I think, really reflects the seriousness of intent in the Commission to address this crisis, particularly on affordability. And it, I think, addresses the growing sense that the EU must contribute to addressing it, whilst, of course, respecting the principles of subsidiarity in the internal division of competences with member states. It's particularly welcome, if in this House, if I could say it, that the European Parliament has established the Special Committee on Housing, chaired, of course, by Madam Tignali, and we're very pleased also that we continue to see such great attendance at this joint hearing. I think it shows how seriously this House is taking housing. Now, again, first and foremost, housing is and will remain a primarily national, regional and local responsibility. But as President von der Leyen has said, if housing is a problem for Europeans, it's a problem for Europe. So we are committed in the Housing Task Force to support as effectively as we can the member states, the cities, the regions in any way we can by identifying that European added value. We've heard from Nicola and from Ruth today, the responsible officials in Regio and employment, on the regional and social aspects of this. We, in the newly established Housing Task Force, will work closely with them and all the colleagues across the Commission and all parts of this Parliament to help coordinate the different work streams, to support Commissioner Dan Johansson and his colleagues in bringing forward and implementing the first ever European Affordable Housing Plan, probably in the first quarter of 2026. The first priority then for this year is a major outreach and dialogue with member states, with the Parliament, with the other institutions, with all stakeholders to try to ascertain clearly the key housing priorities at the EU level. Delighted that we're doing this in a joint launch of this consultation process with the House Committee of the Parliament on Monday the 24th. So I'm now doing free publicity for that. It's already booked out. You can follow it online. And it will only be the kick-off event for what I think will be a very widespread consultation for us at the European level to listen and to learn from events like this and to help find practical solutions to the crisis. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Baldwin. It comes to an end. We are in the end of our second session, and what is clear that the growing European housing crisis demands a people-centered response to ensuring housing policies that grant access to quality, affordable homes for all citizens. I would like to thank all speakers and members who have taken part in that discussion, and we have heard a number of policy points and we can take forward in our ongoing and future work, including by rapporteurs of the Regi, Ample and House committees. As Ample Chair, I'd say thank you, and the closing remarks are from
we
your
are,
side, Madam
yeah, no,
Tinali.
we are way over time, but I really want to thank all the participants and the experts, the Commission, and of course my colleagues from the Ample and Regi Committee. I think we are doing a brand new exercise here. So we are setting the ground for the debate and for the policies to come. So it is very important that we gather all the inputs, all the ideas, with the goodwill to really provide solutions. So I really invite everyone to come on Monday for the launch of the consultation. This will be an opportunity, and please also bring these to all your colleagues, stakeholders. This is a real opportunity to set the ground for future policies for something that is really important for our citizens. So thank you very much, and this is just the beginning. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to thank you all for your contribution to the debate. Dear colleagues, let's continue working together on the INI report. The role of the cohesion policy investment in resolving the current housing crisis, guided by our shared commitment in boosting affordable housing for all Europeans. Thank you for your attention. We see you in almost 2 hours. Thank you.